Our YouTube. Good evening, welcome everybody. My name is Keto. I work for Keep Growing Detroit, and today we are going to be talking about season extension. So extending the growing season in ways, tools and techniques to extend the growing season to be harvesting crops possibly year round. So we'll get into all the details about that. Once again, for those who are just joining us, you can either drop questions in the chat or you can just feel free to come off mute if you have questions at any point, since we have somewhat of a small group today. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen and we'll get into the presentation. Oops, not that kind of share. Slideshow. Okay. So winter harvesting. There's a few images of some farms with some of the tools and some crops growing during the winter months. We have on the left here, we have the quick hoops or lobe tunnels, which is a great protective structure at one of our old farm sites over or just outside of downtown. And then on the right hand side here, we have one of the stars of growing vegetables during the winter. One of the specific crops that grows really well is spinach, and this is a great crop of that. So I just want to highlight one of the people who really was a pioneer with season extension, a gentleman named Elliot Coleman. He's written a bunch of books on organic farming as well as season extension. And he has this great quote here: to make a real difference in creating a local food system, local growers, including folks at home, need to be able to continue to supplying fresh food through the winter months. Clearly, and just like we can do this here in Detroit, and to do that without marketing increasing our expenses or our consumption of non-renewable resources. So hopefully we'll be addressing some ways to go about doing that that you can find practical for whatever you're doing at your space. I will say Elliot Coleman, if you're interested in his books, you can just look up his name and they'll come up. But another one is Four Seasons Harvest, and boy, there's another one that's on season extension too. That's not coming to mind. Maybe I'll think of it in a minute. And then next, I'm just going to refer to kind of a mind map of like some kind of tools and just some ways to think about season extension from a longtime friend of Keep Growing Detroit, John Birnbaum. He put this together, who is now retired, but used to work for the Michigan Student Organic Farm and Michigan State University. But he always referred to it, this concept as perpetual produce. This is the concept of trying to figure out ways to have food available, fresh food available all throughout the year from local sources. And we're going to be focusing tonight on ways to be growing and harvesting those out of our gardens. But in this little map here, there's some other things that are kind of referred to that I think are worth thinking about. Particularly, like we can look at preservation, whether that be having a root cellar and harvesting winter storage crops like squashes and potatoes and turnips and carrots, or processing, whether that be freezing or drying or canning or fermentation. These are all ways that we can kind of continue to have healthy, locally sourced foods available to us, and done, grown by us, and another way to kind of always have something fresh to eat. Some of the tools up in the right-hand corner here that are referenced: low tunnels, cold frames, greenhouses, high tunnels, quick hoops. We'll talk about those a little bit more in detail later in the presentation. So I think that's the biggest, kind of thing that I really wanted to kind of reference for this particular presentation today. Okay, so season extension defined. Hold on, let me get you guys out of the way. So it's basically trying to use specific tools and techniques that allow us to grow crops outside of the typical growing season. So here in Michigan, I think everybody's pretty familiar, but just to say, we can typically start growing crops around April, outside, in ground, and then, usually by October, or so, we're pretty much wrapping up our gardens. And there's a couple of different factors for that, and we'll talk about that more in detail. But some of the advantages of season extension, and this, applies in many ways to like people who are growing for market, but there are also some that are related for folks who are just growing for themselves or for their family. So possible year-round income. So like basically a regular steady flow of produce throughout the year instead of that, specific growing season window. And then just kind of continuing availability. And then the kind of disadvantages is, I think in short is, it takes a little bit, sometimes, there's investment for some of the tools like the high tunnels, or there's different types of protection that you can use, whether that be low tunnels, cold frames. Those are on the kind of cheaper end of things. And then there's, more kind of costly structures like high tunnels or hoop houses, which are great tools, but you just need to consider, is it worth the investment to be able to have the produce like and that if you're thinking about that. Okay, how are we doing so far? And I must say, I do not have the ability to see the chat right now. So I'm going to ask a favor. Would somebody be willing to watch the chat for me and just kind of, if anybody has any questions, again, feel free to come off of mute if you want to just ask a question. That's great. But if somebody would be willing to just keep an eye on the chat for me and let me know if any questions come about as we're going along here, would somebody be willing to do that for me?
Yeah, I can do it.
Thanks, Anthony. I appreciate it.
No problem.
Okay, so the three basic components of season extension, this is kind of the meat and potatoes of what we're talking about today, there's three kind of tenets that we're going to go through in detail. First off, is cold hardy vegetables, or using particular types of vegetables, particularly if you're trying to grow into the winter months, things that can tolerate cold, and we'll talk about that in detail. And then the other side of things is or pushing vegetables outside of their typical growing season. So, we're at this time of the season, we're thinking about extending the season going into the winter, but you can also think about it on the beginning of the season as well. And that would be more trying to get things that like it warmer started earlier. Tomatoes, for instance, you can, in theory, start tomatoes up to a month prior to when you would typically be growing them in the field. Second tenet of season extension kind of philosophy is succession planting. The basic concept of staggering your plantings in the beds or throughout the season to have continual harvest. And then finally, the tool of protected cultivation. So that would be, these structures I've been mentioning a little bit, like the low tunnels, the high tunnels, the quick hoops, all that kind of stuff. Okay, so how does it work? When for the growing in the winter months, we're trying to think about planting cold tolerant crops. And we're going to get into that, with some images in a second, but generally speaking, they can be the crops that grow best, when it starts to get cold and can tolerate freezing temperatures when those come about, are leafing crops and rooting crops. Yeah, go ahead, Heather.
I can no longer see your screen. Is it just, I'm not sure if it's just me. Can other people see the screen?
Yeah.
I'm just getting the wheel of death that says that you've started screen sharing.
Okay. It's how did it change? Well, let me stop share and reshare. Let's try that. How about now?
Still spinning.
Okay. Anybody else?
No, I can see it.
I can see it.
I can see it.
Okay, well, it must just be on my end then.
Okay, it'll be
Maybe I'll
Heather,
get out.
it'll be in the recording. So, and I will share the slides with everybody afterwards, so you can reference them then.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Okay, so again, the two kind of main categories for winter production of crops that we would like to be growing or that perform the best are generally speaking leafy crops, or leafy greens, and then rooting crops, with the exception of things that don't like it cold. And that would be potatoes and sweet potatoes are both technically hot crops, even though they are root crops. They come from climates that really prefer, warmer environments to grow and thrive. And so the other piece of the puzzle here is that we are essentially, when we're thinking about the end of the season, so essentially our growing, the factors that affect us being able to grow vegetables are, having adequate sunlight, having adequate access to nutrients or soil, or soil quality, having, and then some degree of warmth, particularly important, or a certain temperature, particularly important for germination, and then plants, a lot of plants below a certain temperature either don't grow at all or grow very slowly. So that's why, like here in Michigan, our typical growing season is April through October, how I was kind of talking about earlier. And that's highly affected by day length. And so plants essentially don't actively grow once the day lengths get below 10 hours of sunlight. And so we're trying to get, so when we're trying to establish crops to be able to be harvesting during the winter months, we're really trying to get them up to size or get them close to harvestable size before that, before the days dip below that 10 hours. So that usually falls around the beginning of November. So we're kind of working backwards. So we're using, the days to harvest on our seed packets. And then we're also working backwards from like November 5th, we'll say, roughly November 5th or November 1st, like it says on the sheet here. And then, in addition to that, because, days to harvest is something that we use as a guide when we're planting seeds. It gives us a general sense of how long it will be until we can harvest those crops. But as the days, our days are slowly getting shorter and shorter and shorter. So that also like slows the crop growth down a little bit. So that's another thing that we need to factor in, is that these crops are also growing a little bit slower. So while I have some recommended planting dates for a lot of these crops, we'll reference them in a little while. But this is the general concept, is that we're trying to get these things, at the very, and some can even tolerate, just can thrive with just a very limited amount of protection. How are we doing on the chat?
Good, no questions.
Okay. So, and then basically once the crops are established, we're gonna get them, some sort of protection. And in some cases that could be as simple as just a little bit of insulation from some straw, like mulching a bed of carrots really well, that are well established, could be enough, especially if we have mild winters. And then we just got to get on to a routine of harvesting those things. And there's a little bit of finesse that you don't want to harvest them, because like in some cases that spinach, like I was showing earlier on the first slide, will actually freeze solid, but then and then the sun comes out, warms it up a little bit, and it becomes unfrozen, and you want to harvest it when it's not frozen. If you harvest it when it's frozen, it'll go limp and wilty. Okay, so let's spend a little bit of time talking about these cold hardy vegetables. So there's some categories broken down a little bit further. So there's leafy cooking greens, like our collards and our kale, mustard greens, things of that sort. There are heading greens, with, that would be heading lettuces and cabbages, escarole, things of that sort. There's rooting crops, that's our turnips, beets, carrots, parsnips. And then there's baby leaf salad greens, which, there's a lot of variety to generally to the baby leaf salad greens. They could range, basically there's types of lettuces, and then there's like some that are like kind of loosely related to collards and kale. They're in the brassica families, and there's lots of Asian and Japanese varieties that are really awesome. So we'll get into some pictures and images of those in a bit, but so this is kind of coming back to that idea of planting dates, and here is a nice reference chart of some of the crops that you might think about growing. So you can see here that we are really in the window for getting a lot of these things planted now, to be ready before those weeks dip below the 10-hour, the days dip below that 10-hour mark. So essentially we got there's some things that are kind of maybe slightly more well-known, and a few things that are maybe slightly unusual. To talk about those a bit. So there's kale. In this case, they're talking about kale, like full headed kale, so like full mature kale, kale plants. And then there's tatsoi. Tatsoi is kind of like in that family of brassicas, like I was talking about earlier. Tatsoi is like, if you're not familiar, it's kind of similar to spinach, and it's got a little bit of celery kind of ness to it in terms of the stem being thicker and kind of a water thing. It's really good for steaming, stir fries, things of that sort. And then we got full headed spinach. Like I was saying earlier, spinach is one of the stars of season extension. This is absolutely, if you walk away from this class with one thing that you should do to test your skills with season extension, is try planting some spinach and get it going through the winter. And one of the reasons, and not only because it's a good performer, but it's probably the best spinach that you'll ever taste, because once a frost hits that spinach, it gets really sweet. And this is something that applies to a lot of these, especially the leafy crops. It's a really interesting phenomenon. Basically, my understanding of what is happening when plants get a little bit frosted is they have this natural mechanism that when they're starting to anticipate the cold, is they take up more sugars from the soil into the plant, because those sugars act as an antifreeze. And so and they help them stay and not basically help the plant survive those cold temperatures. And we get the benefit of really sweet and delicious tasting spinach and kale and so forth. So more Tatsoi, Bok Choy, similar to in that kind of Asian greens category, like I was talking about a bit earlier. And then I'm going to go on here, and here's a few others. This is by no means an exhaustive list, but these are a few things. This is taken from the Johnny Seeds website. They have a really nice chart that you can populate your own dates on there to have reference for what weeks that you could be planting this stuff by, to make sure that you get a nice crop before it gets the days get too short. You'll see on here, here's where we start to see some of those root crops, the radishes. Radishes is a real great one because they're such a short turnaround. They're only 25 or 30 days. It's a little bit late to start carrots. But one thing to note here is this is essentially when we're trying to strategize, referencing these charts and these planting dates is when we're trying to strategize to be able to harvest late into the fall and early winter. But it also could be something where you're trying to get these things planted, even if you get a late start on them. So like, you're like, oh man, I would have loved to get some carrots going. Well, you could still start some carrots and get them established. And the benefit there is that you would essentially get a jump on the season next year. So if you had those carrots inside your quick hoops or your cold frame or whatever, as soon as those day lengths started to get longer again in February, in the February timeframe, then we're looking at and then they're gonna, as soon as you get a little bit of warmth in there, and they'll start to develop again, and you'll be able to get a really early harvest on carrots, much earlier than if you put the, otherwise you probably wouldn't be able to get the seeds going until until that time, and the harvest is like at least 60 days later for carrots, as an example. Okay, how are we doing so far? Any questions? What's going on?
I have a question, Keel.
Yeah.
What about like plants that you've from, I guess maybe like spring, or that you've kept through the summer? Like I'm thinking of like Swiss chard and kale that's kept going. Like,
yeah.
Is that you just keep them going for your winter crops, or like should
yes, you can.
newer?
And actually, right. So you definitely can, and actually you can definitely keep collards and kale and some of those things that are just continue to be harvestable. You can keep those going. And sometimes without even much protection at all. The downside is they get a little bit tall, and they may or may not fit under the quick hoops if you're going that path, or definitely would not fit in the cold frame. But the only thing that's maybe, if we get any really cold, deep cold weather, which seems to be happening for us, used to be kind of more January, but now it seems to be pushing into February, or even March sometimes. But we get those cold, deep cold days. They might, because when they get really mature, they tend to get, the stalk gets really woody, and the lignins are really established, and which causes, if there's any kind of intense freezing temperatures, it may cause the stem to split, which could kill the plant. But all that said, yes, you can definitely play around with that and experiment and try things. If you got those crops going already, I definitely keep them going. If the only no, I'll leave that there. Okay, keeping going. Here's another just thing. It is is maybe slightly more complicated for the small scale home grower, but it is, I do want to reference this just because I think it's a really helpful concept to start to get familiar with in terms of planning for your garden in general, and thinking about, all of these crops and how to have something growing all through the season. Like basically, another concept I would really like to encourage folks to think about here is that, we can tend to be on this thinking of, we plant one thing in a bed at the beginning of the season, and that's the only thing that's going to grow there. And once it's harvested, then that spot is open, and that's that. But in theory, if you could be in the very beginning of the season, you could plant some radishes. Those are about 30 days to harvest. And then right after those radishes, you pull those out, harvest them, eat them, and plant something else in that spot. So there's this idea that you can always try and be occupying space in your garden. And then this concept is bringing that into the protected cultivation. In this case, it's the hoop house. So this would be a larger structure, which is in essence, prime real estate, because it's our, this is the spot that we have to be able to grow during those winter months. So we're trying to make the best of it, and actually all throughout the season, right? So, and so the concept here is kind of categorizing all of these, categorizing these crops based on how long they need to be in the ground till they come to their fruition. So there's long residency, and essentially long residency crops and short residency crops. Okay. So long residency means that they're going to be there for a number of months. So in this case, if we're looking at August planting, which, we kind of missed a little bit of the window on, but, for the theory and concept and conversation here, these are things that would have been planted in August with the intention of harvesting through the winter months and through, and if you see that arrow that's there, and this arrow is going all the way through to spring. So that would be, those crops are going to be in there until probably the middle of April. So, and then below that would be, either fall late long residency crops or fall late short residency crops. So short residency would be things that you planting nowish, September, right? Where you would be harvesting these through before early spring, basically, and we're defining early spring is when those day lengths start to get long again. I haven't really spoken much to this. I referenced it a little bit, but essentially we're talking about when the days start to go above that 10-hour length, which would be essentially by the middle of February, when you would think about starting to get things planted again inside that protected cultivation. So we got so essentially, if we're planting lettuce or spinach or radishes, turnips, cilantro, things of that sort, that would be planting right now and harvesting it by February, maybe even by the end of the year, as soon as we're, or whenever we want, really, but once it's mature, but leaving space for that early spring planting in February here, and which we're, so that's where this red arrow is taking us, right, with the fall late residency stuff. Okay, so this is just some concepts to play around with, and let's just take a minute and get a little bit more familiar with some of these greens and crops that some some you may not know. We got spinach here. I do want to note on the upper left-hand corner, I do want to note that there are a bunch of different types of spinaches, and there are some that are, they when you're going to the seed company, if you're ordering seed, I mean, Keep Growing Detroit definitely supplies a lot of these seeds. But it is always interesting to look at seed catalogs and get a sense of, sometimes they're intended for specific purposes or cultivated for specific purposes. And there's definitely a variety of spinaches that are intended, or have been cultivated for winter planting or for winter harvest. So make note of that. I think space is one of them. So there are smaller leaf spinaches, and then there's bigger kind of savoy leaf spinaches where they can be as big as, my head essentially, or slightly bigger. Right next to that, we got beets. In this case, it looks like they were growing the beets for the beet greens. So it could be something where it's a double harvest concept where you plant them really thickly, and to be able to do a beet greens harvest when they're young and slightly immature, more like a salad green size, like 2 to 3 inches. And then we thin them out to give out space for the beets to grow to full size. And then right here are mustard greens. And I want to note here that every one of the greens, just about every one of the greens, I can't think of one that would not necessarily apply offhand. So I'll just say, generally speaking, all of the greens can be grown for baby greens or for full size. So in this case, we're looking at mustard greens that are full, mature, kind of cooking style mustard greens, but they also can be planted really densely for a salad mix, or for intended for to be harvested when they're 2 to 3 inches. Essentially, if they're really densely planted, they'll grow up to that size. And then, if they get to be any bigger, they'll start to get leggy, and they won't really, they will struggle to thrive. So, that's when we're thinning them out if we want to have, move towards having a larger crop. Lower left hand corner here, we're looking at Swiss chard. And then we got some of the kales we talked about. So, generally speaking, and kind of speaking a little bit more to what I was talking about earlier in terms of established collard plants that you might want to protect, the crops that like thrive the best in the freezing, thawing, and cold weather are going to be younger, more younger plants, shorter, smaller plants that they have more ability to tolerate the freezing and thawing during the winter months. Then, spending a minute here on some of the heading greens, we got some upper left-hand corner, a few varieties of lettuces. I will note that some of these things that are high water content, so the heading lettuces, the bok choy in the upper right-hand corner, the Napa cabbage in the lower left-hand corner, things with high water content like these, we're really trying to like get these in and probably get them harvested before the end of the year. They won't do very well with those really hard freezing temps when we start to get as the winter really sets in, and how it's been kind of going the past few years is like usually into the beginning of the year, January, February. More examples of spinach, lower right hand corner. Now we're into some of the root crops, just highlighting some of the varieties. There's lots and lots of different types of radishes. We got in the upper left hand corner. The colorful ones here are called Easter egg, but there's ones that are like the French breakfast, which are more long and slender. There's daikon radishes that are much bigger and longer, more like 8 to 10 inches long, and a couple inches in diameter. Again, we're really probably trying to focus on some of the smaller ones, and radishes are really great performers. On the right hand side, this might be unique to some people. These are salad turnips. So I think the classic turnips that most folks are familiar with are larger. They're more the size of a baseball or a softball, and probably more intended for cooking or eating for the greens. In this case, these are more the size of a golf ball. They're slightly smaller. They're real tender. They have a mild flavor. If you like, I tend to like these better than radishes because they're not as spicy as the radishes can be. And they're really a nice addition to a salad. They're good for fresh eating. You can steam them or cook them like you would the standard turnips, but definitely a good option. One of the kind of really well-known varieties of this is Hakurai. It's a kind of a cultivated Japanese variety. Lower left-hand corner, we got more beets and beet greens, and then right-hand carrots. There's definitely a lot of carrot varieties that are specifically have been cultivated for the winter production. So if you're looking if you're looking at the seed catalogs, be sure and be looking for those. And here's just showing some images of some hoop houses growing in the winter months and harvesting. We got Billy and Jerry Ann Hebron here, and they're just pulling some radishes out of the ground. And you can see there's a snow just out, like a big snow load outside the hoop house there that they're in, just kind of proof in the pudding that you can be harvesting this stuff during the winter months. Here's some examples of some radishes in the ground, really dense planting here. Now we're talking, moving on to another really good performer and kind of useful, this is a type of crop that grows really well for the season extension during winter months. And these are a bunch of different types of baby leaf salad greens. So upper left hand side, there's this is a type of lettuce. In the middle here is I believe Mizuna, which is one of the many Asian varieties. There's ones that tend to be mild and nutty, and some are tend to be slightly more spicy with that kind of mustard flavors going on. Upper right hand corner would be looks like baby leaf Napa cabbage, and then lower left is a couple different, I think that would be arugula, and then in the lower right hand corner would be baby leaf beet greens. You can do that with Swiss chard. There's a whole in a lot of the seed company catalogs, there's a whole section of the catalog just dedicated to all the different varieties, colors, shapes, forms of different types of baby leaf salad greens. And really you can see in these beds here that the way that they're planted very densely and intended to be harvested when they're only 3 or 4 inches high. Delicious, harvested fresh for a salad. Once they will, after a while, you can usually get 2 or 3 harvests off of them. They're great for selling at market. And then you could let them grow a little bit. You could thin them out a little bit, let them get a little bit taller, and use that for braising mix for some kind of simple cooking. So there's a few different options about how to use those. Oh, let me go back. Okay, some Swiss chard. Miss Floyd here, another example of folks harvesting during the winter. You can see that she's got some lettuce that she's harvesting. She's got inside of the hoop house, she's actually got the beds mulched a little bit as an added layer of protection. Another image of some lettuce mix. Spinach, like I referenced at the beginning. This is that Mizuna. I think this is some form of bok choy, red colored. Okay, so now just a few things that when you're growing in, particularly growing in high tunnels or the bigger hoop house type structures, here's a few of the things that are people are usually trying to get established early in the season. I'm going to take a pause here for a second and just make a note. So so far we've just been talking about, I just really wanted to kind of drill down on those crops that are going to be good for the winter months. And you'll notice I just want to kind of emphasize that anything that's a fruiting crop, so anything that like cucumbers, melons, tomatoes, squashes, eggplant, peppers. All of those are fruits. They have seeds in them, and fruiting crops do not like cold weather. So we're trying to, the only way we can really extend the growing season for them is to get them started earlier. And to some degree, we can actually keep their, like, for instance, if you had tomatoes or any of these crops growing, you could, you know, they're in their prime season right now. It's tomato craziness right now. But you know, if you had those crops established and they're still growing, or you did a late planting, you could be harvesting those much later than some of the other folks would. Like, you know, tomato growing season is basically done in the next, you know, by the end of this month, you know, probably by the end of September. And if you had those in a hoop house, you can maybe get a couple more weeks out of them. But essentially here we're talking about, you know, peppers, basil, cucumbers, squashes, tomatoes, eggplants. And we're essentially trying to get those, you know, planted. Typically, you know, those hot crops we would be planting outside after the last frost, but with some protection, even using some of the simpler protective structures like the low tunnels, you could, you know, in theory, try and get some of these crops started earlier, so you get a little bit of a jump on the harvest. You know, because they, you know, once you get them in the ground, then you're going to get a little bit closer to getting them harvested sooner. Okay, so before we move on to the next section, I just want to do a check-in. How's everybody doing? Any questions? Looks like the chat hasn't changed much. You guys don't have questions. It makes me feel like I'm not doing my job. Okay. Well, hopefully you're getting some good stuff out of this. So next we are talking about succession planting. So how, you know, basically we're trying to time our crops to get more productivity out of one particular spot in the garden. So essentially the definition is planting 2 or more different vegetables, the same or different vegetables in the same garden space within one growing season, you know, which also applies to following one crop with another, right? Okay, so take a look at this, and this is going to take a little explaining, but this is a planning tool that is kind of the model that a lot of farmers use to be able to set up a farm plan at their space to always have something planted in, you know, a particular space in their garden, so never to have unused space. So for the example here, and excuse how the colors kind of look on the chart. I think still get the picture here, but essentially if you look at the bottom of the spreadsheet here, there are 3 raised beds, and it's a little bit cut off on the right here, but essentially the 3 4-foot by 8-foot raised beds, and each raised bed is broken up. And this could be, in this case, I'm kind of going macro or micro. I'm like showing, you know, very small, these raised beds broken up into smaller sections. Farmers oftentimes will do this with fields or rows. They'll have a farm broken up into fields, and the fields broken up into rows, and that they may reference this as, you know, field 1, rows A through Z, for example, you know, 26 rows or whatever. But for this example, and you could translate this into, you know, something that worked for your garden. And if you're interested in this chart, I can share it, and you can kind of use it as a model. But the idea here is that so we have a representation. We have a representation of the entire all of these beds. And then if you look at the top of the spreadsheet here, each of those boxes represents a week in the year. So, you know, it represents the entire growing season essentially. And so we can look at, you know, if we go across row 1A, that on April 21st, we're going to plant head lettuce. And then if we follow that, this is telling me I know that I have lettuces take around 45 days to harvest, or a little bit, roughly a month and a half. So if I look at this, then, you know, it goes in the middle of May and into June, in the beginning of June, is when I would anticipate harvesting my head lettuce. So if I planted, for instance, if I planted 6 or 8 heads of lettuce, they would be occupying that space 1A in the first raised bed here. And I would know that when to anticipate harvesting that. In this case, I do a little gap here and I wait 2 weeks, give the soil a little bit of a rest. You don't necessarily have to do that. You could maybe just put down some compost and get planting right away for the next round. But in this case, the next thing I'm doing is planting bush beans in the mid-late June, again, occupying that space into August. And then as the bush beans start to fade, I'm getting ready for a spinach planting, all those things. And I could probably squeeze in some radishes early on in the season. So this is by no means the best planting plan ever. It's just a kind of an example I put together. But the concept here is a really, I think, useful planning tool for succession. Another way of thinking about it is actually staggering plantings. So in this case, on the chart that I'm referencing here, we got lettuces followed by bush beans, followed by spinach, or beets followed by bush beans, followed by beets again, followed by spinach. But you could also do, if you planted, all right, so say, let's look at 1C, right? So that's 8 square feet of carrots. And if you planted that entire area with carrots, that's a significant, it's a pretty good, if it's just you and your family or a couple people, that's a pretty significant amount of carrots in theory that you would have from that harvest if you planted them all at once, right? But what you could do is do, have that whole section reserved for carrots. But what you do is maybe on March, at the end of March, you plant your first round of carrots in these top 2 squares, and then a week later you plant the second 2 squares, and a week later the third squares, and so on and so forth. And basically that's staggering the planting and then ultimately staggering the harvest. So you're not harvesting, you don't have all those carrots ready to go at once. I mean, carrots actually is not a great example because carrots can actually hang out in the ground for a while. But if it was beans, for example, or radishes, for example, they'll get to size, they'll be a nice, perfect, edible radish, and then they'll start, and then they'll get over mature, they'll start to send up a seed head and bolt, they'll get tough and woody. So if you had too many radishes to harvest at once and you're like, oh man, I cannot eat any more radishes, you can maybe stagger your radish planting to be able to have a staggered harvest. Okay. Any questions on that one? Cool, let's keep going. Now we're getting into the third tenet. Well, wait, you know what? Let me back up for a second here. Is there anything else I wanted to talk about here?
I actually have a question on this one.
Yeah.
So this may be a different thing altogether, but What about like planting like stuff within, like I'm thinking about like planting like carrots in a bed and then saving room for tomatoes and allowing like to plant with like around those areas, just because it seems like, looking at my garden right now, there's a lot of room in between the tomatoes where like
Yeah.
something like carrots could, be to kind of help like utilize the space a little bit
Yeah.
better.
Yeah. Great point. And I thanks for bringing that up. So, and I really want to highlight what you just said there. So I'm looking at my garden now and I'm observing and thinking about, well, what could I have done? Right. That's a very, very useful, thing to do with the garden. Like, I just want to emphasize, like, this is the time of the year to start to reflect on the garden. And what, maybe I could have, like, what did really well? The tomatoes did really well. What didn't do so well, and maybe trying to deduce why it didn't do so well. Did it get enough sun? Did it get enough nutrients? All those things. But it's just a great time of year to reflect. That aside, yeah, so it's something that you have to kind of experiment with, because it's like, you never want to. So on the one hand, yes, there are definitely some techniques that you can kind of do one and plan for another, and try and do dense plantings and things. But on the other end of the spectrum, if you have things too densely planted, then they're all going to be competing for resources, including, soil resources and light resources. And you may be creating a situation where one doesn't perform very well for that reason. So, and it comes with trial and error, and getting to understand like what the mature plant is going to look like, and think about that. I'm thinking about my home garden, and my wife was like, oh, I'm going to plant these eggplant where right next to where the zucchinis are going to be, or the peppers. And like the zucchinis, they just got huge, and they ended up shading out some of the hot peppers and the eggplants, because they just get so big so fast. But that said, there's a number of things that you can play with. One technique that is, like, I'll give you a few examples. So early in the spring, when you're thinking about or just anytime you're thinking about planting carrots and lettuce, carrots is unique because they take up to 2 weeks to germinate, and then and they have a lot of because their leaf structures are really fine and lacy. They often have issues with competition from weeds. So one strategy I've seen people do is doing carrots kind of interplanted, like a row of carrots, and then every, say, 6 inches, and then between those, so 6-inch plantings, every rows of carrots every 6 inches roughly, or 8 inch, maybe more like 8 inches. And in between those, doing baby leaf lettuce, and just like a thin layer, so that it grows enough to kind of shade out the ground between the carrots. It matures relatively quickly. So you can kind of get those harvested, and they'll be pretty much harvested and done by the time the carrots have got themselves pretty well established. And then the carrots hopefully will kind of take over that space and shade out any kind of weed pressure. And I've seen people play around with that, with planting things like you were talking about, tomatoes, planting things at the base of tomatoes, like it could be, it could be a late season green that does okay with the hot weather, or just so, like, say you're usually, we're transitioning. The other kind of piece of the puzzle here, and just referencing this chart in general, is really, for this to work well, we need to know the nature of all these crops, and that when their prime growing season is. So I do want to highlight that like, we have on the early end of the season, we have things that are, our cold crops, can like to be started in cooler weather. And then in the middle season, things that either can tolerate heat or really like the heat. And then again, on the end of the season, things that are, more tolerant of cold crops. So definitely, takes time to get to know all these crops, their days to harvest, and their preferred kind of time of year to be growing. But you could be getting something started like a late crop of spinach or lettuce, and then plant your tomatoes, interplant your tomatoes into that, knowing that you'll harvest those heads of lettuce by the time those tomato plants start to take off. So the only thing that I would just have the caveat of, like, if it's something that's going to be kind of growing, they're both long season crops, like tomatoes and eggplants, or tomatoes and squashes, like think about what the mature size of that plant is going to be, or get a sense of that. And like anything in the squash family, like winter squashes, melons, cucumbers, well, maybe not as much cucumbers, you can trellis those relatively vertically to get them out of the way, but zucchinis, summer squashes, they just tend to take up a lot of space, and they will easily shade out other things if they're too close by, even if they don't look like they will from the get-go. Lesson learned once again at my home garden.
Well, thank you.
Okay. So now we're talking about protected cultivation, or essentially like how, essentially the concept here is how to buffer the intense winter weather for these crops. For the most part, all of the ones that we've talked about thus far, they can tolerate freezing or some frost or the cool weather. When we get to extended below freezing temperatures, or in some cases when things go down to zero, some of these crops will crap out. But carrots and spinach are two stellar examples of ones that will just do just great. But there's a range of different ways that we could be protecting these crops. So the very low tech, most simple, cost-effective way would be starting with something like mulching. When I say mulch in this situation, I'm more speaking to mulching with straw or with shredded leaves, not so much with wood chips. That's not really encouraged. We generally don't encourage that in beds, just because wood chips, they take a long time to break down. They can kind of tie up nutrients in the soil, and they just kind of make it not so great for when you're trying to plant seeds, because they take so long to break down. But using mulches like straw, so I think I referenced early on, was if you get a nicely established bed of carrots, for example, just a little bit of protection with the 4 or 5, 3 to 4 inches of straw would be a nice way to buffer freezing and protect the plants enough to do what you need to do. Next step would be cloches or cold frames. Cloches, I didn't really include them, but I will mention them really quickly. It's a really old concept of, like, they used to be these looked like a glass bell. They were about 2 feet or 1.5 or 2 feet in diameter, or this glass bell that they would put, that old-timey farmers would put over individual crops, and that would give some protection. You could, basically use that same concept with, cutting off the bottom of a clear milk jug, and play around with that. And that tool is also, if, say you were like, I'm gonna play, I know that the last frost date in the spring is typically around the beginning of May, but we've been having some warm springs, and I want to try and get some tomatoes in the ground earlier, and I'm just going to do a really low tech, and you get them planted at the middle of April. The weather's looking pretty reasonable. And then it's the end of April and we get frost advisories. You could use this simple, close concept to protect those plants from the freezing temps, just to get them through that one frost event. So yeah, I'll just keep going here and show some of these images, and I'll talk more about them as we go. Here's an image of like the classic old school basic cold frame. Essentially, you could do the same kind of concept over a raised bed, even an existing raised bed, 4x8 or otherwise. But essentially you're putting a hinged door with a clear cover on it, or a hinged lid with either glass or plastic, as a protective little structure. And these have been around for ages. This is one of the like super old school concept. You can play around with creative ways to do that. Here's an example of using some old shower doors. You can use old window sashes. You can use clear plastic, like painter's plastic that you get from the hardware store. Excuse me. The downside of that is that that clear plastic tends, or the standard kind of plastic tends to break down within the sunlight. It photodegrades and it becomes brittle over time. So when you're looking at some of the greenhouses, the plastic that's on those, even though it looks very similar to the standard kind of painter's tarps, they have a special chemical in them that prevents them from photodegrading, so they last 4 or 5 years. Here's some images of some cold frames without the lids, and then these lids are just kind of stacked up along the side here. And here's what it looks like with the lids covering them. And some other kind of images. These are kind of old school. That's a picture of that guy, Elliot Coleman, I was talking about earlier, and him harvesting some spinach out of there, and what those cold frames look like with a bunch of snow around. So I want to highlight, this is probably one of the concepts that I think is the most kind of accessible and functional for most gardens around the city. It's really low tech and pretty cost effective, and it's called a quick hoop. There's 2 different ways to do it. In this case, Mr. D and I were putting in some quick hoops over at his garden, and we were basically using CPVC, PVC conduit, 1/2-inch PVC conduit, and basically marking out and spacing 4-foot wide beds, and then taking a metal, you can see that dibble that he's using to make holes in the ground every 4 feet, and then bending them over, and making these hoops over the beds. And then here's what it looks like when you start to, and then basically covering it with row cover and tying it off at the end with like a bread bag style. And this is kind of what it looks like when it's complete. So this is one concept, and kind of an improvement on this is using a metal conduit. So it's basically the PVC conduit and the metal conduit are both, you can find in the electrical section of any hardware store. We have kind of leaned more towards the EMT metal conduit, 1/2-inch, and we have a special quick hoop bender that you can access at the Keeper in Detroit farm if you're a Garden Resource Program member. So basically they come standard in 10-foot lengths, both of these types of conduit. And if you're interested in doing that, all you got to do is you get yourself some conduit and make an appointment with me, and we can set up a time to meet at the farm and bend them for you. A few things I want to highlight here is that we're using we're using weights at the bottom of each side of every hoop. And then when you want to go in and harvest, you can use like alligator clips or something of that sort to lift it up and to get in there and do your harvesting or that kind of thing. Here's another not so great photo. Another example. Here's some examples of them being installed on a kind of a large scale on over acres with machinery, but just to show that it's a concept that is really well established. You'll note that these have holes poked in the top of them for ventilation. In this case, in this situation, we're using row cover. So row cover is spun bound plastic, which has the ability to breathe. It allows air to flow flow through it, and to some degree it allows water to come through it. But it adds, it has some thermal protection, and it buffers the plants from the snow load weighing down on it and damaging the plants. Once we get into really, heavy snows, I don't know, we're gonna get more heavy snows here in Michigan. But if we get to like 4 or 6 inches of snow, you probably want to think about using, some kind of plastic too, in addition to the row cover, just to slough off the snow, because that row cover will is a little bit fibrous, so it'll tend to be a little bit tacky. So you do need to think about clearing off the snow, to put it briefly. Okay. Here is another project I did some years ago of making a larger structure out of a similar size, the electrical conduit from the hardware store. In this case, it was a 1 inch diameter conduit. And so, this basic concept with a pipe bender and some simple tools, you can really put together a nice simple structure. And I'm gonna share another product that's out here that's out in the world that's similar. So I do that, share, and then I'm going to so this is what's called a caterpillar tunnel. These are like kind of the step up from those quick hoops. A bit more of an investment, but it's a really, on the spectrum of tools that are available, they're kind of a nice option. The company is called Farmer's Friend. You can see it in the upper left-hand corner here. And these two structures, they don't have end wall coverings in this image, but typically you would put them, but they're essentially a very simple frame. You can get them in 14 or 16 foot wide, and they're relatively easy to install. So we're just basically pounding some re-rod into the ground and installing the hoops, assembling the hoops on the ground and sliding them over the re-rod, and then you tie it all together with some angle bracing and a rod across the top, and so on and so forth. If that's something that you're really interested in, I can definitely give you much more detail about them. So yeah, this is another kind of great tool. You'll see that they have some caterpillar tunnels in here some quick hoops inside for an added layer of protection. So that's just one more example of kind of ranging in prices, just to kind of give some perspective. For the quick hoops, we're talking about, I think a piece of metal conduit is probably $4 or $5. And so if you wanted to cover, say, a 4x8 raised bed, you would use like 3 of those, and then the row cover or plastic to cover that. So is probably another 10 or 15. So for $50 to $75, you could have, something that looks akin to this, or to go over a raised bed. when you get into something like this, you're probably looking at closer to $500 or $1,000. You know, and then for the Caterpillar tunnels, their base pricing is somewhere around you know, for let's look at the 50-foot long. So for a 14-foot wide by 50-foot long, for just under $1,500, you could have. I mean, that's a pretty significant size, and you know that could do a lot of winter growing just for. And this is kind of the smallest of the bigger structures, but just to give you a sense of pricing on that. Okay. Keeping going here. Oh. I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of these features on these tunnels. There, you'll notice that there's kind of opening along the sides, and this is a form of ventilation that's called roll-up sides. And there's usually some kind of ridge ventilation or up towards the peak of the tunnels. And door options. And here's a close-up of the roll-up side. And here's another model that we did that is a kind of a movable style. So it could be, you know, basically with the concept of it could be moved over one crop or another as you kind of progress it in season. Here is assembling one of those Caterpillar tunnels with the option of the roll-up sides. And these are some scissor doors on them. Now getting into some of the bigger structures, they tend to be that now when we're talking about some of the bigger structures, you may have seen, you know, some of them around the city. There's a decent amount of high tunnels around the city Detroit these days, ranging in size from, you know, 20 to 30 foot wide and up to 70 foot long, 75, 72 foot long. If you've ever been to the Keep Growing Detroit farm, we have two one's technically a greenhouse because it's heated, and then the other one we're using for season extension production, and that's pretty big. It's 30 foot wide and 144 feet long, so it's a lot of stuff can be grown in those. When you get into some of these bigger structures, we're talking about you know, so this is probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 by 72 for this structure. And you're probably at that point looking at in the neighborhood of $10,000 to $12,000 once you're starting to get into these sizes. And there's options for ones that are movable. And you know, here's some examples of crops growing in the ground with them. And here's here's an image with some combination movable tunnels and then some low tunnels in the field. Okay, so that is, I think, what I wanted. That's the base of my presentation today. So at this point, I'm going to open it up for questions, and we'll take it from there. How's everybody doing? Okay. So I covered a lot of information today. Hopefully we got some good stuff for you to think about. So my challenge to you is to grow at least try one crop this season. Try extending your growing season. And I want you guys, particularly, you know, like I've mentioned a few times now, think about trying to grow spinach. We're definitely in the window. It's the only kind of finicky thing is like we would probably want to start spinach you know, soon-ish before, if we really wanted to get it to mature size. But the kind of flip of that is that spinach does not germinate well in warm temperature soil. So probably would let it cool off a little bit. It's a good thing that we're starting to get cool nights again. That'll be to your benefit for that effort. But I would say, you know, even if you waited 2 or 3 weeks later, you know, later in September, you know, you could still get that stuff started. So play around with that. If you're a Garden Resource Program member and you want to give growing in quick hoops a shot, and you want to bend some quick hoops, reach out to me. I'll put my email in the chat here. And we can schedule a time to get some bent for you. Okay, so let's see. I'm looking at the chat here, just checking in on some of these questions. You know what? And another thing I just want to mention is that, you know, that you can kind of play around with if you have raised beds, you can actually either use pipe clamps or a slightly larger diameter conduit cut down, so you can have those hoops that just slide into little holes along the bed. So it's kind of ready to go. When you're ready to do some protection, you just bring those out, slide them into the clamps or the holes, and you know, that works out pretty nicely. Cindy's asking, are small animals a problem with these tunnels, like cats, rodents, etc.? Well, I think if you sew up the edges, most of these things are not super appealing, I would say, to rodents in particular. I mean, they're, you know, some people talk about voles. Like, I haven't heard people complain a lot about voles kind of in the city environment. That'd be more like a country thing. But yeah, you know, it is possible. Cats, probably not so much. As long as you're just kind of like, you want to, you know, like, that's why we're putting the weights at the bottom. One of the reasons that we're putting the weights at the bottom of either side of the hoops on either side. But you know, pest management is something to always kind of consider. But generally speaking, I haven't, you know, in some of the larger structures, occasionally that's an issue. Sometimes people will, you know, set out traps for that reason, or they'll play around with using where the roll up sides, so they can't just walk in. They'll put up some kind of screening or a metal chicken wire or something like that. Okay, going on the list here, my kale and Charlotte's telling us that she's got some kale and bok choy still doing really good. That's great, good news. Yeah, I mean, you could basically, if you had one of these larger structures, in theory, like if you had the caterpillar tunnels I was talking about, you could take the whole cover off and just leave the cage up during the summer months if you wanted to, because of if you wanted to, you know, enjoy the garden in the ways that you're talking about with pollinators and such. Okay, so with that, looks like we got some inspiration going on. People are thinking about, you know, maybe doing this, trying things out. So I'll open it up one more time. If people want to come off mute, or if you want to drop any questions in the chat. Other than that, we'll wrap things up for the day. I will be posting this video on our YouTube channel, and give me probably early next week. I'll be able to get to that. And then I will also share a PDF of the slides from tonight's presentation. And other than that, I hope to see you guys on the flip. Maybe we'll see you out in the garden. And happy winter growing, I guess. All right. So have a good evening, everybody.